Unit 1, Introduction to Psychological Disorders. 1.2 Introduction. Mrs. and Mr. live in a middle-income group flat in a colony in North Delhi. Mrs. is a housewife and Mr. is an accountant in a private firm. They have 2 children, a 17-year-old girl and a 13-year-old boy who study in a government-aided school. The family neither interacts with neighbors nor are they welcomed in their house. They do not have friends as Mr. feels that neighbors and friends are not sincere, and they would ridicule Mr. and his family and divulge their family details to others. Mr. returns home every night in an inebriated condition and abuses his wife and children. According to him, his life has been destroyed by marrying a worthless, ugly woman. Mrs. responds by crying, feeling helpless, and spends most of the time in her room complaining of various aches, pain, fatigue and lack of energy to do any work. She feels her life is worthless and often talks about killing herself. In fact, she had attempted to commit suicide by taking a heavy dose of sleeping pills but was saved due to timely intervention of her daughter. Lately, Mr. has been taking frequent leaves from office and behaved aggressively with his superior. The incidents invited a termination that was revoked only after the intervention of his boss, who took a considerate view because of his children's pleading. He has been allowed to rejoin office after a stern warning of not repeating misbehavior in future. Mrs. and Mr. Both parents are not concerned about the falling grades and bullying behavior of their son at school. Several notices from school for parent-teacher meeting have been ignored, as Mrs. is too ill to go out of house and Mr. is too busy to attend to a useless matter. Daughter feels overburdened as she must do the household work along with studying for her class 12th board exams. She complains of being overwhelmed by her mother's illness, father's callous and abusive behavior, domestic violence, and apathy of her brother. In the past 15 days, she has fainted twice, and the general physician has diagnosed her condition as malnourishment and stress. As you read this story, does it raise several questions in your mind, such as, is Mrs. and Mr. S. household normal? Do Mrs. and Mr. have a psychological disorder? Do Mrs. and Mr. require psychological intervention? Why does son show a bullying and a careless attitude? Is the daughter's response to her family situation normal? Is the whole family pathological? Can something be done to improve the family's functioning? We may not have immediate answers to these questions, but we might have concluded that the nature of problems described here is psychological and some or all members may be suffering from psychological disorder. The subfield of psychology that studies nature, causes, and maintenance of psychological disorders is known as abnormal psychology. In this unit, you will learn about the various terms and concepts related to abnormal psychology and also about how psychological disorders are classified. 1.3 Concept of abnormality and normality. The term normal comes from the Latin word, norma, a 17th century Latin word which literally means carpenter's square, or right angle, whereas the term normalis derived from norma means made according to a carpenter's square. In the 19th century Latin, norma meant rule or pattern and the term normalis meant conforming to rules, common standards, regular, usual. So, since 19th century, the term normal in English derived from the Latin term normalis means conforming to rules, standards, or a pattern. The term abnormal comes from a summation of 2 Latin terms ab and norma, where ab means off, away from, deviate and norma means rule, so abnormalis in Latin means deviating from a fixed rule or irregular. So, its English derivative, abnormal means not conforming to rule, deviating from a type, standard, contrary to system or law, irregular, unnatural, http://www.etymolene.com. Thus, normality implies conforming to rules, standards, patterns, whereas abnormality means deviation from rules, standards. When you say, "Oh, she is abnormal as she is behaving absurdly," come on, it is normal for him to cry if he has lost his beloved pet. Who sets these rules and standards? It is individuals as members of groups, community, and society who set the rules or standards to be followed by all the members. However, since these are value-laden terms, what may be considered normal by some people may be considered as abnormal by others and vice versa. This becomes more challenging as not only the subject matter of the field of abnormal psychology, but also its very nomenclature depends on the clear distinction between normality and abnormality. Experts agree that it is almost impossible to discuss abnormal behavior, psychopathology, without the framework of values. Hence, it has been suggested that values should be explicitly put forth while defining normality and abnormality. Let us consider the concepts of normality and abnormality defined by various experts in the following section. 1. Criteria of normality. Sheldon J. Kachin, 1986, has based his views of normality on the survey conducted by Offer and Subshin, 1966, on the varied meanings of normality in the different fields of study such as psychology, anthropology, sociology, and psychiatry. Normality as health. It means absence of sickness is normal. Thus, a person who does not have any pathology, i.e., who is symptom-free and is not hospitalized or underwent treatment is normal. It implies that most of the people are normal, while only some are abnormal. Normality as ideal, utopia. It goes a step further from viewing normality as health, i.e., as being symptom-free. It says that normality does not mean only being free from disease, but it means achieving the ideal state, such as Rogers' fully functioning person, or Maslow's self-actualized person, or Allport's mature personality. However, you must have noticed the term utopia in parentheses. Utopia means an imagined place or state of thing in which everything is perfect or ideal. This raises another question, i.e., what is perfect or ideal? There is no clear-cut and single answer to this question, as what is perfect for one person may not be so for another. People's values define perfect or ideal state. Since values entail biases, so it has not been possible to conclusively define the ideal or perfect state. Thus, being in an ideal state is imaginary and impossible to achieve. Freud, therefore, has referred to normality as ideal fiction. Nevertheless, it is an important criterion, as the goal of psychologists is to help people achieve health and optimum level of functioning. Normality as average. Nature tends to distribute a given attribute or phenomenon in the world in such a way that most of the cases representing that attribute have similar values, while only a few cases have extreme values. If a mean or average is calculated of these values, then most of the cases tend to cluster around the mean, while those with extreme values tend to fall away from the mean or average. In statistics, such a distribution of cases is known as normal distribution and is graphically represented by a bell-shaped curve, called the normal probability curve. The cases clustering around average are conceptualized as normal, while the cases at the extreme as abnormal. According to statistical theory, cases clustering around average are normal, while the cases falling away from average at either side are abnormal. Moreover, the farther away a case is from average, the more abnormal it is. Statistical description is believed to be scientific. However, it is not value-free, since we do not describe both the extremes equally as abnormal. For example, a person can have an IQ, which deviates from average on either side of the normal probability curve, i.e., it can be significantly above or below average, but we describe only the IQ significantly below average as abnormal. Nonetheless, the concept of normality as average is utilized widely in clinical practice for diagnosis and assessment. Normality as socially acceptable social norms determine normality, i.e., behavior which conforms to the social norms is normal. This implies that we should neither seek nor accept the universal definitions of normality. Rather, normality is a socially specified concept. According to Ralph Linton, 1956, the tests of absolute normalcy are the individual's ability to apprehend reality, as understood by his society, to act in terms of this reality, and to be effectively shaped by his society during his developmental period. The test of relative normalcy is the extent to which the individual's experience has given him a personality conforming to the basic personality of his society. In 1930s, anthropologists gave the concept of cultural relativism to describe the role of society in defining the normal behavior of an individual. According to cultural relativism, what may be considered as normal in one society may be considered as abnormal in another society. For example, possession by a goddess is normal in some Asian societies while it may be considered as a mental disorder by Western societies. A problem, however, in defining normality as socially acceptable is that it entails a risk of encouraging conformity and nonconformity as a criterion for normality and abnormality, respectively. Conformity to social or cultural norms is taken as a sign of normality, however, rigid conformity may be pathological. For example, rigid conformity to social norms laid down by an autocrat is pathological, whereas nonconformity to such behavior is normal. This has been clearly illustrated by Milgram's classical study. In his study, Milgram showed that the participants were ready to give electric shocks. Participants were made to believe that they were giving actual electric shocks to the other participants, Confederates, in the other room despite listening their screams. Most of the participants showed conformity to the researcher's instructions even if it meant hurting others. Very few participants showed nonconformity. Thus, we can see that conformity to social norms may not always be normal. Normality as a process. Normality defined as a process defines it temporally. That is, over the time, as an individual passes through different developmental phases, his /her behavior is evaluated according to the given phase. Thus, babbling is considered to be normal for an infant, but as an abnormal behavior for a 5-year-old child or for an adult. 2. Criteria of abnormality. Several criteria of abnormality have been identified. Lilienfeld et al., 2013. The more someone meets these criteria, the greater the possibility for them to show abnormality. Distress in psychology. Distress can be defined as mental suffering or mental agony. Thus, any cognition, emotion and or action causing mental suffering or mental agony in an individual may indicate abnormality. However, distress does not always indicate abnormality. Further, presence of abnormality does not always lead to distress. For instance, a person who reports distress due to worrying about an impending job interview cannot be labeled as abnormal. Furthermore, a person suffering from an abnormality such as anxiety or depression reports distress, whereas another person suffering from an abnormality such as the manic phase of bipolar disorder, or substance use disorder, or antisocial personality disorder does not report distress. Social discomfort. Another indicator of abnormality is violation of an implicit or unwritten rule by an individual that causes discomfort to others. For example, to greet someone is an implicit rule. However, you feel uncomfortable if a stranger in a crowd suddenly rushes to you, greeting you excitedly with a forcible handshake. but you also have a sense of discomfort if someone known to you doesn't greet you at all or discreetly greets you and rushes away. Thus, whether this behavior can be categorized as abnormal depends on the situation. Maladaptive behavior causes impairment in personal, occupational, and social functioning of an individual, and thus it is an indicator of abnormality. Does maladaptive behavior always lead to impaired functioning? Consider the cases of two individuals, Miss D and Mr. J. While Miss D suffers from obsessive-compulsive disorder where washing compulsion led to elaborate cleaning rituals that significantly interferes with her daily life functioning, affecting her psychological and physical well-being. On the other hand, Mr. J has an antisocial personality disorder due to which he indulges in extreme risk-taking behaviors, endangering his life as well as that of others. But rather than considering it as maladaptive, Mr. J enjoys his behavior. Though, Mr. J's behavior is not maladaptive to himself, but it is maladaptive for others. Hence, it is clear from the example of Miss D and Mr. J that a behavior which is maladaptive either toward self or society or toward both is an indicator of abnormality. Standard deviation abnormality is also defined in terms of deviation from normal, i.e., being away from normal is abnormal where the AB means away. In other words, rarity is an indicator of abnormality. However, rare does not always means undesirable. For example, in case of IQ, a score which is significantly above or below mean is away from normal, hence both the scores should be considered as abnormal. However, while the score significantly below the mean indicates intellectual disability, ID, and referred to as abnormal, the score significantly above the mean score indicates genius and is not referred to as abnormal, though it is also away from the mean. Culturally unexpected /violations of the standard rules of the society. Culturally unexpected action or an action that violates the standard rules of the society is taken as an index of abnormality. For example, going into a trance or being possessed by a ghost or a goddess is accepted in Indian culture. However, it is context dependent. Thus, if an individual goes into a trance in an overnight religious gathering called Jagaran, it is seen as normal. However, if a person shows the same behavior in a daily life setting like school, office, or home, it is interpreted as abnormal, as going into a trance during daily life routine is not culturally expected. It is clear from the above discussion that there is neither a necessary nor a sufficient criterion for defining normality and abnormality. That is, there is neither a single criterion that is present in all the normal or abnormal behavior, nor there is any single criterion that is enough to indicate normality or abnormality. Nevertheless, there are several criteria, which indicate abnormal behavior or psychopathology and need intervention for the well-being of the individual as well as society. Hence, psychologists have attempted to define a psychological disorder based on these criteria of abnormality. There are two standard classification systems for defining and diagnosing psychological disorders, namely, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, constructed by the American Psychiatric Association, APA, and the International Classification of Diseases, ICD, provided by the WHO and is used widely outside the USA. Several editions of both the manuals, DSM and ICD, have been published over the last 75 years. The latest being DSM-5 and ICD-10. DSM-5, APA, 2013, defines the psychological disorder as a syndrome that is present in an individual and that involves clinically significant disturbance in behavior, emotion regulation, or cognitive functioning. These disturbances are thought to reflect a dysfunction in biological, psychological, or developmental processes that are necessary for mental functioning. DSM-5 also recognizes that mental disorders are usually associated with significant distress or disability in key areas of functioning such as social, occupational, or other activities. Predictable or culturally approved responses to common stressors or losses, such as death of a loved one, are excluded. It is also important that this dysfunctional pattern of behavior do not stem from social deviance or conflicts that the person has with society as a whole. Though this definition is arbitrary as it does not satisfy all the professionals, but it is a working definition that allows us to delve further into the area of psychopathology. 1.4 Historical perspective of psychological disorders. Psychopathology, conceptualized as an abnormal condition of human beings, has a long history. Perhaps, it is as old as the advent of humanity on this earth. Let us trace the journey of psychopathology described by BAPCH, Hooley, and Meinecke, 2019, as an exclusive field of study from the ancient past to the present era. The ancient period. The story begins before the Common Era, BCE, as is evident from the human skulls found with holes drilled into them. This procedure is known as trepanning, which was used as a treatment of psychopathology. A hole /s were bored into the skull of the affected person to let out the psychopathology causing evil spirit and thus, cured the person. Surprisingly, some of the people not only survived such crude treatment, but also lived beyond treatment, as some of the skulls showed signs of healing. This is one of the earliest examples of demonology and exorcism, which continued over several centuries into the Common Era, though without drilling holes into people's skulls. Magical potions, sacred chants, holy water, and charms were used for exorcism. For example, the New Testament narrates an incident which describes Jesus exorcising demons out of a woman through chants and holy water. Although the demonology dominated the psychopathology scene before the Common Era across the globe, however, somatogenesis, idea that origin of the abnormal behavior is the body, was in nascent stage in different ancient civilizations like Greece, Egypt, China, and India. For example, in Greece, Hippocrates, 460 to 377 BC, revolutionized the understanding of nature and causes of abnormal behavior. He suggested that brain was the seat for consciousness and pathology of brain lead to abnormal behavior. In ancient India, a religious text, Atharvaveda, described the mental disorders in terms of severity and prescribed its treatment. Further, Charak Samhita and Sushruta Samhita were written by medical practitioners Charak and Sushruta, respectively. Both the treatise described mental disorders as originating from internal causes, within the body, external causes, environment, and psyche. China had a well-developed field of medicine during the 2nd century. Chongqing, a renowned Chinese practitioner who is referred to as Hippocrates of China, wrote 2 extensive treatises in medicine in 200 AD. Like Hippocrates, he also suggested both somatogenic and psychogenic explanations for mental disorders. In Greek and Roman empires, Hippocrates' tradition was carried forward by the Greek and Roman physicians. Egyptian medicine was also influenced by Hippocrates' work and flourished. Sanatoria were founded in the temples of Saturn to provide pleasant surrounding as a remedy for mental illness. Rome was indebted to the progressive work in medicine by Galen, 130 to 200 AD, one of the most influential Greek physicians who furthered Hippocrates' work. He suggested mental disorders are caused due to physical and mental /psychological related factors. BAPCH, Hooley, and Meinecke, 2019. B. The Middle Ages. The Middle Ages witnessed views of abnormality in Asia and Europe. While the scientific approach of Greek medicine was adopted by the Islamic world and flourished in the Middle East, like Baghdad, Damascus and Aleppo, Polvan, 1969, Europe was plunged into darkness, as it reverted to demonology and exorcism for the treatment of mental illness. In contrast to the humane treatment of mentally ill in the Middle East under the guidance of Avicenna, 980-1037 AD, the prince of the physicians, inhumane treatment was meted out to the mentally ill in Europe. In the 14th century and 15th century Europe, plague, famines, fiefdom, and poverty led to several episodes of mass madness. The mass madness was characterized by collectivist abnormal behavior, where large groups of people believed that they were possessed by devil/wolves/witches and thus behaved abnormally, like howling, dancing, jumping, convulsing. People could not relate the mass madness to the social stresses such as famines and plagues and believed that either they were poisoned by insect bites or were possessed by animals or supernatural powers. At the time, when the first mental hospital was founded in Baghdad to treat the mental disorders, Europe was trying to treat mental illness through exorcism and witchcraft. Many people, particularly women accused of having a secret pact with the demon and witchcraft, were persecuted and burnt at stake or beheaded in public. BAPCH et al., 2019. c. 15th to 18th centuries. Fortunately, Renaissance occurred in Europe between 15th and 18th century, and provided the much required impetus for the scientific temper that challenged the underlying superstitious explanations for mental disorders. For example, a Swiss physician, Paracelsus, 1490 to 1541, gave a scientific explanation for mass madness. He rejected the superstitious beliefs and suggested that mental diseases rather than possession were the cause of mass madness. A German physician, Johann Weyer, 1515 to 1588, was deeply upset by witch hunting and published a book in 1583, on the deceits of the demons as a rebuttal of the Malleus Maleficarum, Witch's Hammer, which was a guidebook for witch hunting, published in 1486. Weyer was one of first few physicians who specialized in mental disorders. His extensive contributions and progressive attitudes in the field of mental illness earned him the title of the founder of modern psychopathology. However, his modern outlook was far ahead of his times, and even many of his colleagues did not agree with his views, and he was ridiculed. Due to his critique of witch hunting and possession, the Church turned against him and banned his works. However, voice of reason could not be stifled for long, as even the Church faced dissent from clergy on the issue of maltreatment of mentally ill. For example, Saint Vincent de Paul, 1576 to 1660, risked his life to advocate for humane and medical treatment of mentally ill people who he insisted were diseased and not possessed. BAPCH et al., 2019. According to Butcher, Hooley, and Meinecker, 2019, persistent advocacy of scientific view for the study and treatment of mental illness gained ground in Europe, which paved the way for the establishment of mental asylums in different parts of Europe. Though these asylums were established with a good intention of providing humane treatment to the mentally sick people, however, the conditions at these asylums soon became deplorable. While severely mentally ill people were chained, starved, and were put for public exhibition for a small fee, those with mild and moderate mental illness were forced to beg on the city streets. One such asylum was St. Mary of Bethlehem in the 16th century London, which was notorious as Bedlam because of the poor living conditions and excessive noise made by the inmates. Asylums for mentally ill were also established in other countries such as Russia, 1764, Mexico, 1556, France, 1641, and USA, 1756, 1768. Unfortunately, these mental asylums were a modification of penal institutions like jails. Though the goal was to treat the mentally ill, however, the treatment techniques were harsh and crude, like physical restraints, throwing into icy cold or hot water tubs, blistering, bleeding, electric shocks, etc. Though many of those techniques were precursors to modern-day treatment, but the underlying idea was to intimidate and frighten the patient into compliance, so that they were forced to choose rationality over insanity. Thus, most of the mental asylums in Europe and USA worked on the premise of frighten and treat and needed reforms. A pioneer in the humanitarian reform of the mental asylums was Philippe Pinel, 1745 to 1826, in France. Pinel advocated for the kind treatment of people with mental illness. He emphasized that the people languishing in asylums were sick and not criminals or beasts and should be treated with compassion and kindness. He unchained the asylum inmates and provided the clean, hygienic surroundings with sunlight and fresh air, food, and water. BAPCH et al., 2019. Around the same time when Pinel was implementing the asylum reforms in France, William Tuke, 1732 to 1822, in England established a pleasant country home, named York Retreat, where patients with mental illness lived and worked in peaceful environment. Tuke's reforms gradually found supporters in medical fraternity, such as Thomas Walkley and Samuel Hitch, who facilitated engagement of trained nurses and supervisors to take care of patients in the asylums. Such reforms not only revolutionized the treatment of the patients with mental illness but also brought a change in public attitude towards mental illness. Further, it led to constitution and implementation of parliamentary acts, like the Lunacy Inquiry Act, 1842, and the Country Asylums Act, 1845. Under which every county had to mandatorily provide asylum to lunatics and paupers, and all the asylums were to be inspected regularly for ensuring the provision of amenities like clean environment, proper diet, and elimination of inhuman treatments such as chaining and beatings. Gradually, these acts were extended to all the British colonies such as Australia, Canada, India, South Africa. Pinel and Tuke's reformative work not only earned them supporters throughout Europe, but it also found resonance across the Atlantic in the work of Benjamin Rush, 1745 to 1813, in USA. Rush was the founder of American psychiatry and an advocate of moral management of patients with mental illness. Moral management has its roots in the reformative work of Pinel and Tuke. It is a treatment which takes a global view of the patient by addressing his /her personal, social, and occupational and spiritual needs. The moral management showed astonishingly high discharge rates of patients. Thus, moral management achieved a very high success rate for curing patients with mental illness. BAPCH et al., 2019. The 19th to 20th centuries, however, the galloping moral management with its significant effectiveness was halted by several factors. BAPCH et al., 2019. First, moral management was crushed under its own weight for many reasons, such as, reformers were not able to train their successors who could replace them, overstretching of existing hospital facilities, and an increasing number of immigrant patients led to ethnic/cultural clashes between the staff and the patients. Second, advances in biomedical science led to emergence of a view that all mental disorders are caused by biological factors and thus should be biologically treated. Lutyens, 1989. Hence, one can say that in the nature-nurture debate, nurture lost its position as a causal factor for mental disorders. Third, mental hygiene movement was started by a school teacher, Dorothea Dix, 1802 to 1887, who championed the cause of inmates left to languish in prisons and mental institutions in subhuman conditions and forgotten by their families as well as society. She carried out a campaign, named mental hygiene movement to awaken public as well as legislatures to the plight of forgotten inmates. Her campaign raised millions of dollars in funds for more suitable mental hospitals. She successfully persuaded government agencies to build public-funded mental hospitals. Earlier, most of the mental institutions were charitable facilities under private trusts. Mental hygiene movement led to considerable improvement in the condition of the mental hospital in USA. Dix was instrumental not only in establishing mental hospitals in USA but in other countries also, such as Canada, Scotland, etc. She successfully established a total of 32 mental hospitals through the mental hygiene movement. According to BAPCH et al., 2019, over the next several decades of its initiation, the mental hygiene movement remained active, leading to improved living conditions in the mental hospitals. However, with the death of Dorothea Dix and waning public interest for the cause of mental illness, the mental hygiene lost its momentum. The mental hospitals, though much larger in size and number, reverted to previously miserable conditions, with their inmates once again being conspicuous by their absence from public discourse and memory. Thus, despite the sincere efforts of Pinel, Tuke, Wakely, Hitch, Rush, Dix and perhaps many more unknown benefactors, the mental asylums and hospitals remained overcrowded, deplorable places with malnourished and maltreated forgotten patients. The mental asylums and hospitals aroused in public image of an eerie dungeon with horrific, frightening, and dangerous occupants. One reason for an unchanging negative public opinion about mental hospitals and their inmates was the silence of the psychiatrists' issue of mental illness in public. In the latter part of 19th century, psychiatrists took over the control of mental asylums and hospitals by incorporating the moral management with crude treatment techniques. However, the treatment techniques used by psychiatrists did not prove to be effective in helping the patients. Therefore, psychiatrists could not bring awareness and alleviate fear of mental illness in public. The scenario once again changed in the second half of the 20th century with the successful use of psychiatric medication, chlorpromazine in 1950, which led to marked reduction in psychiatric symptoms and better control on behavior. A small pill achieved something that had remained out of bounds for centuries despite putting in all the efforts ranging from inhuman to humane practices to treat the patients with mental disorders. Medication not only treated patients but also promised better quality of life for them, as they were no longer required to be physically restrained or confined to the four walls of the mental asylum. For the first time in the history of psychopathology, they were found to be fit and free to return to the community. This freedom gave impetus to the deinstitutionalization movement, BAPCH et al., 2019. According to BAPCH, Meinecke, and Hooley, 2019, the deinstitutionalization movement forced the closure of mental asylums and hospitals, a mark of inhuman treatment, and encouraged the society to re-uptake the patients. This was done to achieve more human treatment and reintegration of the patients into the community, thereby improving the quality of life of the patients as well as of the society. With the promise of better quality of life, the deinstitutionalization had a mass appeal and soon became an international movement. Across the world, the mental hospitals were increasingly seen as a sign of oppression and as an encroachment on human rights. Therefore, many countries followed deinstitutionalization extensively, for example, England, Wales, Italy, Hong Kong, Finland, Netherlands, where mental hospitals were closed on a large scale and focus of patient care shifted to community-based facilities. In Italy, in a follow-up study, 22 mental hospitals were closed, with 39% of patients shifted to nursing homes, 29% to residential facilities, 29% to other psychiatric hospitals, and ironically only 2% were returned to their families. Diavanza et al., 2003. The goal of deinstitutionalization was to provide humane and cost-effective treatment to patients in their natural surroundings with personal touch, which could not be achieved in large hospitals with overburdened staff. It was suggested that long periods of confinement in the mental hospitals encouraged patients to take the role of a sick person and made them dependent on others for self-care. Hospitalizations were seen as hindrance to achieve normalcy in patients' lives, for they could not readjust to the community life outside the hospitals. Studies such as the one by Diavanza et al., 2003, clearly indicate that deinstitutionalization could not achieve its original goal of returning the patients to the family and society. In fact, many patients could not readapt to the challenges of family and social living and were pushed to the periphery of society as slum dwellers and street beggars. Deinstitutionalization, on the one hand, freed patients from inhuman treatment of mental hospitals, but on the other hand it failed to make family and social conditions amenable for the reabsorption of those patients. Clearly, this movement could not fill the gaps in the community mental health services. There is no doubt that advanced biological and psychological treatment techniques have increasingly made mental hospitals obsolete. However, the gaping holes in rehabilitation programs have kept alive the debate about the best ways to provide care to the people with mental disorders. Well past the 2 decades into the 21st century, there is a need to develop more evolved two-pronged mental health programs and policies which not only work with the patients but with the society as well, to ensure the personal and integration of the patient as a productive member of the society. BAPCH et al., 2019. At the time, when mental hygiene movement swept across USA, buoyed by industrial revolution, technological advancement also took place rapidly in USA and Europe in the different fields of science like biology, chemistry, and physics. Advanced technology also provided the thrust for the development of scientific research-oriented view of psychopathology, which eventually led to the emergence of contemporary views, causes, and treatment of mental disorders. BAPCH et al., 2019. 1.5 Contemporary perspectives of psychological disorders. A. Biological perspective. Extensive research by several scientists spanning over a century led to the discovery of biological and anatomical causal factors underlying physical and mental disorders. For example, general paresis, a mental disorder which led to paralysis, insanity, and death within 2 to 5 years. The discovery that general paresis is caused by syphilis, a bacterial infection of brain, was a breakthrough in the field of psychopathology as it established the link between the brain and mental disorders. It provided an impetus to the view that all mental disorders have underlying organic basis, thereby opening a new gateway for the biologically based treatment techniques, such as lobotomies. Lobotomies were crude, ineffective, and so were discouraged. While the discovery of organic bases answered the question, how brain pathology causes a mental disorder, however, it did not answer why brain pathology causes a mental disorder. The answer to why remains elusive, as it is still unknown. For example, why brain pathology does not always lead to mental disorder in all the people. Nevertheless, scientists' continued pursuit has helped us to develop better understanding of the mental disorders. For example, classification of mental disorders by a German psychiatrist, Emil Kraepelin, 1856 to 1926, was another major contribution to the field of psychopathology. Kraepelin observed that certain symptoms occur together regularly in a specific pattern which can be grouped to denote a specific mental disorder. Based on this observation, he went on to give a classification system which put the mental disorders into distinct categories with their description, course, and predicted outcome. This laid the foundation for today's classification systems, such as DSM, BAPCH et al., 2019. B. Psychological perspective mesmerism according to BAPCH, Meinecke, and Hooley, 2019, as one group of scientists focused on the biological research. At the same time another group actively explored the psychological causation of mental disorders. Freud undertook the pioneering work in the psychological tradition. He put forth the concept of psychogeny, that is, mental disorders originate in the psyche or mind. He furthered this concept by developing the theory of psychoanalysis, which revolutionized the field of psychopathology and is known as the first force of psychology. The antecedents of Freudian psychoanalysis can be traced back to mesmerism and hypnosis. Mesmerism is a technique that derives its name from its inventor Franz Anton Mesmer, 1734–1815, an Austrian physician. He was influenced by Paracelsus, a 16th-century physician and a scholar who suggested that human body is influenced by planets. Mesmer suggested distribution of a universal magnetic fluid in the human body is affected by planets, which determines health and disease in the humans. He further noted that human beings can influence the distribution of magnetic fluid in each other through their magnetic forces, and thus could cure the diseases including the mental diseases. He was able to cure hysterical paralysis and anesthesia through mesmerism. Mesmerism was initially famous, but Mesmer's medical colleagues and scholars did not find merit in his theory and discredited it. However, later Mesmer's claims were connected to hypnosis, which was practiced by the Nancy School. Nancy School Libio, 1823–1904, a French physician in the town of Nancy successfully practiced hypnosis. Bernheim, 1840–1919, a professor of medicine, was influenced by Libio's successful treatment of a patient through hypnosis, whom Bernheim failed to treat through conventional medical methods for 4 years, Selling, 1943. Working as a team, Libio and Bernheim hypothesized that hypnotism and hysteria are related to each other since both occurred through suggestion. They showed that the symptoms of hysteria, like paralysis of an arm and anesthesia, inability to feel pain, could be produced as well as removed in normal people through hypnosis. Hence, they concluded that hysteria is caused by self-hypnosis. Adherents of the view that mental events could cause mental disorders came to be known as followers of the Nancy School. Jean Charcot, 1825–1893, a leading neurologist in Paris, researched on mesmerism and suggested that hysteria was caused by degeneration of brain areas and thus vehemently disagreed with the Nancy School. However, later, he not only accepted the views of the Nancy School but also actively promoted the study of underlying psychological causes of mental disorders. BAPCH et al., 2019. Psychoanalytic view. Interestingly, the debate on biological factors versus psychological factors as causes of mental disorders continues till today. Nevertheless, by the end of the 19th century, growing research evidence has suggested that mental disorders can be caused by biological and / or psychological factors. Once the causal role of psychological factors was established, the next question was how the psychological factors lead to mental disorders. Sigmund Freud's 1856–1939 work denotes the first systematic attempt to answer this question. Freud was a neurologist in Vienna who went to Paris to study under Charcot and was introduced to Nancy School. Based on his study of hypnosis, Freud concluded that humans are consciously aware of many powerful mental processes. On returning to Vienna, he worked with Joseph Breuer, 1842–1925, a Viennese physician who had introduced talking in hypnosis. Freud and Brewer asked their patients to talk freely during hypnosis, which gave the patients an emotional relief and termed as catharsis. This enabled them to understand the underlying causes for symptoms. Further, patients could not relate their problems with hysterical symptoms. This unawareness led Freud to discover the unconscious and its role in determining behavior, including the pathological behavior. On the basis of these observations, Freud developed the theory of psychoanalysis with different techniques like free association, dream analysis. Freud's psychoanalysis earned both followers and dissidents in the same measure. Though his theory was severely criticized, however, it remains one of the most influential theory, and interest in it persists till date. It cannot be agreed more that the mass appeal of psychoanalysis had popularized it among scientists and lay public equally. A major challenge to psychoanalysis came from the scientific community of experimental psychology. In 1879, Wilhelm Wundt had established the first lab of experimental psychology at the University of Leipzig, to encourage the empirical study of psychological factors that underlie memory, sensation, perception. The study of abnormal behavior by early researchers such as James Hall Cattell was also strongly influenced by the experimental method of Wundt and his colleagues. Wundt's experimental methods were taken to USA by Cattell, and researcher labs were established across USA. Whitmer, 1867–1956, a student of Wundt, established the first American psychological clinic in 1896 in the University of Pennsylvania. Whitmer's clinic encouraged research and therapy related to problems of children with mental deficiencies. Whitmer influenced the growth of clinical psychology as a profession and is considered the founder of clinical psychology. William Healy, 1869–1963, founded Chicago Juvenile Psychopathic Institute in 1909. He was among the first to note that juvenile delinquency is caused by urbanization and not by inner psychological conflicts. Thus, he was among the first to recognize the causal role of environmental or socio-cultural factors in mental disorders. Experimental psychology had prepared the ground against psychoanalytic explanations of abnormal behavior, but it was school of behaviorism emerging out of experimental psychology that formally challenged psychoanalysis. In the early 20th century, Butcher et al., 2019. Behavioral perspective. According to behaviorism, only the behavior that can be directly observed, measured, controlled, verified, and predicted should be the subject matter of psychology. Since subjective experiences, for example, unconscious, free association, dream analysis, cannot be verified by other investigators, hence these cannot provide scientific data. The central theme of behaviorism was that all behavior, including the abnormal behavior, is learned. Hence abnormal behavior can be unlearned, and adaptive behavior can be learned in its place. The behavioral perspective on abnormal behavior was based on classical conditioning. In classical conditioning, a new behavior is learned through pairing of a neutral stimulus with an unconditioned stimulus. It originated in the work of Ivan P. Pavlov, 1849–1936, a Russian physiologist who discovered the conditioned reflex. While working with dogs in his lab, he serendipitously discovered that the dogs began to salivate to the sound of bell after it had been regularly paired with the food. In other words, dogs were conditioned to salivate to a non-food stimulus. In USA, John B. Watson, 1878–1958, was searching a scientific way to study human behavior. Classical conditioning inspired him to study its effect on human behavior, and thus came his famous experimental study with little at applying the principles of classical conditioning. Watson showed that people can be conditioned to fear even the fear-neutral objects, that is, phobias are learned. In subsequent studies with his students, he also showed that by applying the same principles of classical conditioning, phobias can be unlearned also. Watson's experimental studies came as a major blow to psychoanalytic explanations of abnormal behavior, as it shifted the focus of psychology from the study of inner, subjective experiences to the study of overt behavior. Watson named this approach as behaviorism, which became highly influential first in American psychology in 1930s and remains so till today across the globe. Another important contributor in behaviorism was B.F. Skinner's 1904–1990 operant conditioning. Based on experimental studies on animals and birds, Skinner observed that behavior operates on the environment to produce certain outcomes, and those outcomes determine the likelihood of the repetition of that behavior in similar conditions. Simply put, outcomes reinforce the behavior. For example, if a pigeon gets food pellets on pressing the lever, that will increase their lever pressing behavior. Skinner called it operant conditioning. He further suggested that an organism's behavior can be shaped through reinforcement in the form of praise, gifts, prizes, etc. Thus, by withdrawing a positive reinforcement, a maladaptive behavior can be extinguished. Behavioral perspectives challenge to the supremacy of psychoanalysis by shifting the focus from nature to nurture, environment, as the main cause of normal and abnormal behavior, established it as the second force in psychology. BAPCH et al., 2019. Humanistic perspective. Yet another perspective emerging on the scene was humanistic psychology, that came as a response to the deterministic viewpoints of psychoanalysis and behaviorism. According to psychoanalysis, it is the inner mental processes and conflicts, whereas according to behaviorism, it is the environment that determines the human, normal and abnormal, behavior. Both schools ignored the role of evil in human behavior and took a mechanistic view of human beings as if the humans were like machines running on the fuel, unconscious /reinforcement. Humanistic psychology was a response to depersonalization, that was a resultant of rapid industrialization and mechanization. People had begun to feel alienated from their jobs. In psychological labs, research was conducted on animals or on human functions in isolation, away from human beings. King, Woody, and Viney, 2013. According to humanistic psychologists, human behavior is too complex to be investigated by the simplistic empirical research. They tried to restore to psychology distinctly human aspects, such as people's innate capacity for creativity and goodness, and self-concept, mental portrait of ourselves, according to which we judge and interpret our behavior and existence. Humanistic psychology took a positive view of human beings and emphasized on the role of free will, meaning, creativity, values, love, hope, personal growth, and self-fulfillment. According to a famous humanist, Carl Rogers, human beings have a free will, an innate capacity to choose what is good for them through a valuing process, which guides our behavior and help us to achieve a meaningful and fulfilling life. We can achieve self-actualization by developing our full potential. Denial of our own experiences, feelings and values will hamper our personal growth and mental well-being, and lead to psychopathology. BAPCH et al., 2019. The humanistic viewpoint gained momentum in 1960s by questioning the dominant forces of psychoanalysis, and behaviorism grew so rapidly that it was hailed as the third force in psychology. These three forces of psychology have been integrated into a comprehensive and holistic view to understand abnormal behavior, its causes, and treatments. We can appreciate from the above discussion that our struggle to understand and to discern between normal and abnormal behavior has spanned over several centuries. The tumultuous journey of various thinkers and researchers to understand the causes of psychopathology and to find its treatment has led to the emergence of modern concepts of psychopathology. We can say with a great feeling of relief that the past tribulations of humanity at the hands of mental illness have culminated into the contemporary era of scientific understanding of psychological disorders and their effective treatment. 1.6 Classification of psychological disorders. Psychological disorders can have a very significant impact on the life of an individual and their family members. It can affect their development and functioning in academic, work as well as personal and social aspects. The challenge is also compounded due to the stigma associated with mental disorders and lack of availability of sufficient trained mental health professionals. Hence, it is important to make a correct diagnosis as it forms the basis for adequate assessment and appropriate treatment / intervention for the disorder. A diagnosis is the identification of the nature of a disorder. American Psychiatric Association, APA, 2000. It is the keystone in the edifice of assessment and treatment of a disorder. If the keystone is not correctly placed, the building will come crashing down. In order to ensure a proper and uniform diagnosis across the experts / researchers, it is important to have a common classification system of psychological disorders. Like we have standardized psychological tools so that there is uniformity in administration, scoring, and interpreting the test scores. Similarly, a standard classification system of mental disorders ensures correctness and uniformity in diagnosis. Thus, a diagnosis is made by assigning a patient's symptoms to a specific classification system, Rosenberg and Koslin, 2011, which serves as the base and ensures credibility of the diagnosis. Classification is the systematic arrangement of information into groups or categories based on observations. In abnormal psychology, a classification system provides a standard, which can be used to compare an individual's behavior and psychological functioning to diagnose if they have a psychological disorder. Classification in abnormal psychology has been defined as an attempt to delineate meaningful subvarieties of maladaptive behavior. Carson, Butcher, and Meinecke, 2007. Across the world, different classification systems over the centuries have been used to categorize various types of mental disorders based on different principles. For example, in ancient Greece, Hippocrates classified mental disorders based on the level of 4 bodily humors, namely, blood, phlegm, yellow and black bile. For example, a person with excessive black bile suffered from a mental disorder called melancholia. In Chinese medical tradition, body has yin and yang, positive and negative energies, respectively. An imbalance between yin and yang led to mental disorders. In India, the treatise on medicine, called Ayurveda, differentiated between 3 bodily humors, vata, ether, pitta, bile, and kapha, phlegm. The imbalance in these 3 humors leads to different mental disorders. Dwivedi, 2002. Further, 2 ancient Indian physicians, Charaka and Sushruta, classified the mental disorders based on origin, endogenous, Nija, exogenous, agantuja, and psychic, Manasa, Butcher, Hooley, and Meinecke, 2019. A German psychiatrist, Emil Kraepelin, 1856–1926, developed the first modern classification system for classifying the mental disorders, Boyle, 2000. Kraepelin thoroughly and systematically observed patients and concluded that certain symptoms occur in a pattern so regularly that these can be categorized as specific disorders. Based on such categorization, he gave the classification system with 2 categories of mental disorders, manic depressive psychosis, and dementia praecox, modern day, bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, respectively. He also outlined the course of the disorders, i.e., how these disorders progressed over time. Kraepelin's categorical classification system laid the foundation for the current classification systems, namely, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and International Classification of Diseases, ICD. Before we describe these classification systems, let us know the benefits of a classification system and its challenges in abnormal psychology. Rosenberg and Koslin, 2011 1.6.1. Benefits of a classification system. A classification system provides a gist or a concise description of a disorder. Rather than using lengthy descriptions, clinicians and researchers can describe a disorder in small number of words. For example, the term generalized anxiety disorder is enough to understand what it entails without a need to elaborate on its various constituents, such as excessive worry, sleep disturbances, palpitations, chronic fatigue, etc. It helps to group certain specific cognitive, emotional, and behavioral symptoms into a unique configuration. For example, a patient with a diagnosis of obsessive-compulsive disorder tells the clinician that the patient has a certain specific configuration of symptoms and either all or some of the symptoms will be present in him/her. It provides information about the causes, course, and treatment of a disorder. For example, presence of negative symptoms in a patient with schizophrenia implies that it is insidious, chronic, and so it will. 32 Psychological disorders, an introduction have a longer course and will require a different type of treatment for a longer duration. If the patient reportedly also takes alcohol and or other addictive substances like amphetamines, then the causes, course and treatment of schizophrenia will be different from a patient with schizophrenia who does not have a history of substance dependence. A diagnosis based on a classification system enables an individual to seek treatment, support and benefits from the social institutions. For example, a child diagnosed with dyslexia can seek special accommodations and support from school, such as permission to learn only one instead of two languages, providing extra time and a scribe in exams, adjusting the eligibility criteria for admission, etc. A classification system can also provide guidance for dealing with medico-legal cases and to claim insurance benefit. For example, instead of pursuing legal proceedings against an accused who is having intellectual disability, the court of law will deal the case under Mental Health Act of the country based on diagnosis according to the classification system. Similarly, insurance companies also accept the client's claim for reimbursement for treatment of mental disorders on the diagnosis certified by the classification system. A classification system also alleviates the fear of having an unknown, unnamed disorder in people. That is, a diagnosis of people's condition gives them a sense of relief that they are not suffering from an unusual or unique problem. Rather, they have a disorder, which other people may also have. Further, once the diagnosis is made, more can be learned about the disorder, its causes, and its treatments. 1.6.2 Challenges of a classification system. A classification system for mental disorders is very useful, but it also presents some challenges as described below. Bias in diagnosis. According to Meal, 1960, a diagnostic bias is a systematic error in diagnosis. It can occur due to factors such as sex, age, race, community, etc., which may lead to a disproportionately high or low rates of diagnosis of specific mental disorder. The clinician's unfamiliarity with the socio-cultural background of patients may lead to misinterpretation of some behaviors as pathological, resulting in overdiagnosis. On the other hand, underdiagnosis may occur when the patient's reported symptoms cannot be found in the classification system being used. For example, certain symptoms reported by some low-income Mexican Americans do not fit with the classification system currently used in USA, Schmeling and Hernandez, 2005. Further, the linguistic differences between the clinician and the patient may also cause an inaccurate assessment of the mental disorder, Kaplan, 2007. Thus, despite of a classification system, accurate diagnosis may still be a challenge. Stigma of a diagnostic label. A diagnostic label leads to loss of information and stigma for the patient. Once a person is diagnosed with a mental disorder, say schizophrenia, it becomes the most important source of information about the person, i.e., family, friends, colleagues as well as clinicians try to fit their view of that person within the framework of a patient with schizophrenia and ignore his /her other qualities as an individual. Once labeled as schizophrenic, the patient's personality characteristics and abilities become hidden behind that label and people seldom look beyond that label. Not only other people's views get influenced by the diagnostic label, but even the patient's views of themselves may change. Due to self-fulfilling prophecy, a belief that a person with a given disorder behaves in a certain way, the person takes the role of the patient. For example, a child who has been diagnosed with a learning disability will stop taking interest in studies as such children are sick and fail in the class in spite of their best effort. The patient sometimes hides the disorder due to fear of being ridiculed by others, blames self and evades treatment due to embarrassment associated with having a mental disorder. Corrigan and Watson, 2001. Issues of reliability and validity. The utility of a classification system is dependent on its reliability and validity. A classification system is said to be reliable if the results obtained from it are consistent over time. A classification system can have problems in reliability due to several reasons, i.e., lack of clarity in the criteria for disorders, and so the clinician must use subjective judgment to determine if the symptoms reported meet the criteria. 2. Disorders have a significant overlap and hence the clinicians find it difficult to make a distinction among them. Though agreement among clinicians may be one of the factors supporting the reliability of a measure, however, there is a word of caution here. That is, agreement among clinicians may not always lead to a valid diagnosis. For example, agreement over the role of witchcraft in causing mental disorders cannot be accepted as the correct diagnosis. Science does not follow the majoritarian perspective, thus endorsement of a viewpoint by majority of observers may not always be correct. Hence a classification system not only should be reliable, but it should also be valid. However, we have seen that reliability does not guarantee validity. Validity in general means the instrument should measure what it purports to measure. A classification system is said to be valid if its categories show the characteristics of the condition that it is supposed to classify. Therefore, diagnostic criteria for each disorder should be unique. Further, diagnostic criteria should neither be too narrow nor too broad. If the criteria are too narrow, the prevalence, number of people diagnosed with the disorder in a given period of time, of the disorder will be very low. Since, the clinicians will find hardly any cases of a disorder with a very low prevalence, hence it will be difficult to conduct research to find useful information about the disorder, such as its course, gender ratio, etiology, and treatment. If the criteria, on the other hand, are too broad, then the disorder will be very common and its criteria may include characteristic features which may indicate different yet related problems. Such criteria will make the classification system ineffective. Cutchins and Kirk, 1997. 1.6.3 The two classification systems, DSM and ICD. The two most used classification systems in the world are the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, DSM, and International Classification of Diseases, ICD. While the DSM is published by American Psychiatric Association, APA, and is majorly used in the United States, the ICD is published by World Health Organization, WHO, and is used in several parts of the world. In India mostly the ICD is used. The DSM is in its 5th edition currently. It is a categorical classification system with diagnostic criteria for different psychological disorders, such as the kinds, number, and duration of relevant symptoms. The ICD is in its 10th edition and the 11th edition is set to be launched in January 2022. While DSM is a classification system specifically for mental disorders, ICD has other diseases and disorders in addition to mental disorders. It was constructed originally as a framework for collecting the health statistics. From ICD-1 to ICD-6, it classified causes of death. Later on, an effort was made to bring congruence between the DSM and ICD with respect to the criteria of mental disorders with substantial success. Currently, DSM-5 and ICD-10 can be used interchangeably while reporting research in prevalence of mental disorders. The 5th edition of DSM was launched in 2013. It is an improvement over its previous edition DSM-40R, which had the following limitations. Clinicians must determine the clinical significance of the criteria. The DSM-40R uses subjective terms, such as clinically significant, and markedly in its instructions to clinicians for making a diagnosis. It requires clinicians to determine the clinical significance of the enlisted symptoms and criteria. Disorders are defined as categories and not as continua. DSM-40R is a categorical classification system, i.e., either a person has a disorder or does not have a disorder, with nothing in between. However, disorders exist on a continuum as continuous gradations. For example, two persons, A and B, are diagnosed with schizophrenia, while person A is able to maintain the global adaptive functioning, personal, social, and occupational. Person B suffers from delusions, hallucinations, avolition, lack of will, anhedonia, inability to experience pleasure, and is confined to his room, refusing to maintain personal hygiene, interpersonal relationships, and an occupation. Clearly, there is a difference in the degree of schizophrenia in persons A and B, and they should have different prognosis, course, and treatment plans. Heterogeneity in diagnostic categories. Heterogeneity is found in the group of patients diagnosed with the same disorder because DSM-40R requires the patients to have some and not all the enlisted symptoms for the diagnosis. While heterogeneity may not be a problem by itself, but it is possible that heterogeneous groups may represent different types of the disorder and may have a different course, prognosis, and etiology, and thus may require different line of treatment. Messiers and Kirkpatrick, 2001. Possibly, then DSM-40R may be obstructing the path to research about new disorders. Malik and Butler, 2002. All the symptoms of a disorder have an equal weightage. Each symptom in the enlisted criteria may not have equal importance but is given an equal weightage. Malik and Butler, 2002. For example, in major depressive disorder, significant weight loss / gain or decreased / increased appetite and suicidal ideation, both are enlisted symptoms, but clearly suicidal ideation is much more important to be noted. Arbitrariness in the number and duration of diagnostic criteria. A specific number of symptoms for a specific duration must be present to fulfill the criteria for diagnosis of a disorder. The specified number of symptoms has no scientific basis and is arbitrarily chosen. For example, diagnosis of major depressive disorder requires presence of 5 symptoms. Suppose a patient reports 4 and not 5 symptoms, but has significant distress and is in clear need of clinical assistance. Since he does not meet the criteria for 5 symptoms, should the clinician not diagnose and treat him. Restrictive criteria for some disorders and a specific diagnosis labeled as not otherwise specified, numbers, is given to the patients who do not meet the necessary criteria for a given disorder but are significantly distressed. Some of the disorders in DSM-40 are, like eating disorders, have such restricted criteria that many patients do not meet the necessary criteria and hence remain undiagnosed despite distress and impairment. Sloan, Ms., and Epstein, 2005. These patients are given the diagnosis of eating disorders, numbers, which not only hinders their assessment and treatment but also research work in the field of eating disorders. Unnecessary classification of some mental health issues and medical disorders as mental disorders. The number of disorders has steadily increased in DSM editions published since 1952 till date. DSM-40 has classified more than 300 disorders. This inflation is not the result of discovery of new disorders but due to the issues of payment. Erickson and Kress, 2005. That is, to get the reimbursement benefits, the patient must have a disorder classified in DSM. DSM has also begun to include medical disorders, for example, sleep apnea, for the same reason, which are not mental disorders. Erickson and Kress, 2005. Further, some medical conditions were included in the DSM as these could only be treated effectively with psychological treatment. BAPCH al. 2006. For example, irritable bowel syndrome, IBS, which is a gastrointestinal disorder with symptoms like stomach cramps, diarrhea, and bloating, can be treated successfully with psychological treatment. Blanchard et al. 2006. Social factors are not recognized explicitly in DSM-40. The diagnostic categories are based on the intra-individual, within the individual, conflicts rather than the conflict between individual and society. However, social factors such as immigration, discrimination based on skin color, caste, religion, socioeconomic status, loss of job, failure in an exam may lead to depression. Kaplan, 1995. High level of comorbidity raises questions about validity of diagnostic criteria. Comorbidity is found in at least 50% of the diagnosed cases. Kessler et al., 2005. Comorbidity raises doubts about the mutual exclusivity of the diagnostic categories. For example, most people, 50% approximate, diagnosed with clinical depression are also diagnosed with anxiety disorder. Kessler et al., 2003. Such a high level of comorbidity implies that the two disorders may represent different forms of the same underlying condition. This makes the validity of the diagnostic categories doubtful. Commonalities across diagnostic categories are ignored. Commonalities are found across the diagnostic categories either because of comorbidity or because some disorders may share some of the symptoms. Disorders sharing some common symptoms can be classified under an umbrella term rather than as separate disorders with separately enlisted criteria. For example, internalizing and externalizing disorders have emotional and behavioral problems as the common underlying factor. Internalizing disorders are characterized by the over-controlled and externalizing disorders are characterized by the under-controlled emotions and behaviors. However, DSM-40 has not given a categorization of these disorders based exclusively on emotions and behaviors and has left it for the clinicians to find commonalities among these disorders by themselves. Despite several shortcomings, DSM-40 remained the most widely used classification system for more than 2 decades and provided the firm basis for the new edition, the DSM-5. According to Regia, Kuhl, and Kupfer, 2013, changes from DSM-4TR to DSM-5 highlighted the importance of cultural and social context for clinical care and research applications. As the strong link between social environment and epigenetic mechanisms, non-genetic influences on genes that change the phenotypic expression of a gene, heritability, risk and resiliency factors became more evident. The diagnostic criteria for not all but many disorders are now accompanied by referenced findings for such factors. Additionally, cultural references are presented for the symptom expressions with an acknowledgement that a given symptom may be expressed more in a particular culture, for example, European, Asian, or African etc., and cultural syndromes are also provided. The key elements of a diagnosis in DSM-5 is as follows: APA 2013-1, Diagnostic criteria and descriptors. Diagnostic criteria are the standard procedures making a diagnosis. In addition, it includes severity indices, such as mild, moderate, severe, or extreme, and course specifiers, descriptive features, and course, type of remission, partial or full or recurrent. These indicate the current condition of the patient. If the full criteria of diagnosis are not met, it can be classified as other specified or unspecified. The clinical interview and clinical judgment facilitates the final diagnosis. 2. Subtypes and specifiers. As the different individuals can manifest the same disorder in different ways, so the DSM uses subtypes and specifiers to better characterize an individual's disorder. Subtypes denote mutually exclusive and jointly exhaustive phenomenological subgroupings within a diagnosis. APA 2013. For example, enuresis is nocturnal only, diurnal only, or both. On the other hand, specifiers are neither mutually exclusive nor jointly exhaustive, hence, more than one specifier can be given. For instance, major depressive disorder has a wide range of specifiers that can be used to characterize the severity, course, or symptom clusters. The subtypes and specifiers can be distinguished by their number. While there can be multiple specifiers, there can be only one subtype. 3. Principal diagnosis. In case of more than one diagnosis, comorbid disorders, a principal diagnosis is used. The reason for the in or out patienthood is the principal diagnosis, which is also the main focus of treatment. 4. Provisional diagnosis. When a clinician is unable to make a definitive diagnosis due to lack of enough information, however, at the same time, he/she can strongly presume that the full criteria will be met with more information and time, a provisional specifier can be used. DSM-5 classification categorizes disorders into clusters based on shared physiological pathology, genetics, disease risk, neuroscientific and clinical findings. DSM-5 diagnostic chapters: neurodevelopmental disorders, schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorders, bipolar and related disorders, depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, obsessive compulsive and related disorders, trauma and stressor-related disorders, dissociative disorders, somatic symptom and related disorders, feeding and eating disorders, elimination disorders, sleep-wake disorders, sexual dysfunctions, gender dysphoria, disruptive, impulse control, and conduct disorders, substance-related and addictive disorders, neurocognitive disorders, personality disorders, paraphilic disorders, other mental disorders. ICD. According to the World Health Organization, ICD is the foundation for the identification of health trends and statistics globally, and the international standard for reporting diseases and health conditions. It is the diagnostic classification standard for all clinical and research purposes. ICD defines the universe of diseases, disorders, injuries and other related health conditions, listed in a comprehensive, hierarchical fashion that allows for easy storage, retrieval and analysis of health information for evidence-based decision-making, sharing and comparing health information between hospitals, regions, settings, and countries, and data comparisons in the same location across different time periods. http://www.who.int/classifications/ict/en/right. The ICD-10 was launched in 1990. It includes various mental and behavioral disorders in Chapter V as given below: organic, including symptomatic, mental disorders, mental and behavioral disorders due to psychoactive substance use, schizophrenia, schizotypal and delusional disorders, mood, affective disorders, neurotic, stress-related and somatoform disorders, behavioral syndromes associated with physiological disturbances and physical factors, disorders of adult personality and behavior, mental retardation, disorders of psychological development, behavioral and emotional disorders with onset usually occurring in childhood and adolescence, unspecified mental disorder. There has been attempts at harmonization of DSM-5 and ICD-11 classification systems by the clinical and research fraternity so that it leads to a more compatible international statistical classification of mental disorders. It will help in achieving a unified diagnostic approach, understanding the etiological factors, and provide better care for individuals with mental disorders using appropriate interventions.